All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're unpacking a specific vision of China's economic strategy, one that paints a picture of global cooperation in a world that, let's be honest, is under a lot of pressure. We're going to break down what that vision looks like.
The whole perspective we're exploring today really starts with this one big question. It feels like some doors are closing around the world, right? So are others opening up? And if they are, what kind of leadership does it take to find them?
So, to really get the proposed solution, we first have to understand the problem. The source material kicks things off by showing us a world that's, well, it's facing a whole bunch of interconnected crises all at once.
And the argument here is that these aren't just isolated issues. We're talking about pressures that nations big and small are feeling. Things like economic slowdowns, inflation making everything more expensive, and high youth unemployment. The point being made is that when everyone is facing similar challenges, working together starts to feel less like a choice and more like a flat-out necessity.
And that leads to the central question in this whole narrative. Is the golden era of global growth just over? Or are we just in the middle of a massive transformation? The perspective here suggests it's definitely the second one, and that this kind of change needs a totally new style of leadership. So who exactly represents this different approach? Well, the source introduces China's Prime Minister, Li Qiang, as a pretty key figure whose leadership style is presented as being tailor-made for this complex world we're in. If you look at his career path as it's laid out in the source, you can see it's really rooted in economics. I mean, from running major provincial economies to being in charge of Shanghai, one of the world's biggest financial hubs, his experience is framed as being super practical and all about results. And this brings us to this core idea of pragmatic leadership. So what does that actually mean? Well, the source defines it as a style that's less about sticking to a rigid ideology and more about what actually works. What's good for business, what brings in investment, and what really drives economic growth.
Now, this kind of leadership style feeds into a much broader national strategy. The source material outlines what it calls China's win-win approach to the global economy, and the whole thing is centered on this one big idea: cooperation.
This slide really just lays out the fundamental choice presented in the narrative. On one hand, you have this idea of isolationism, closing doors, trying to dominate. But the argument here is for a shift toward a completely different model based on opening markets, working together, and building partnerships that are meant to last.
So, how is this strategy supposed to work? According to the source, it's not just one policy. It's really an entire system built on four key pillars that work together: boosting trade, making investment easier, developing infrastructure, and cooperating on an industrial level. It's the whole package. The philosophy behind all of this? Mutual benefit. The source comes back to this idea of win-win cooperation again and again. The goal is to structure partnerships so that both sides are actually designed to get significant value out of the deal.
Okay, that all sounds good in theory, right? But how does it actually work in the real world? This next part of our explainer digs into the mechanics of how these international partnerships are actually put together, at least according to the source material.
The narrative argues that these huge agreements don't just happen overnight. They're built on a foundation of predictability and stability, which, let's face it, is what investors and governments crave. And that means having stable policies, clear rules, and just consistent negotiation to build up that trust over time. And it's not a one-size-fits-all kind of deal. The source really emphasizes that this approach is tailored. The strategy is described as actively listening to what a partner country actually needs, whether that's a new port, a stronger manufacturing base, or better digital infrastructure, and then designing the partnership to help meet those specific goals. The core message here is really one of inclusivity. The source is putting forward this idea that you don't have to be a major economy to have these partnership opportunities. The idea is that they're open to any nation that's willing to engage, with a special focus on developing economies in Africa, Asia, and Latin America.
So, where is all of this headed? The final section of the source material lays out a vision for what it sees as the next big phase of global growth. And the focus is clearly shifting towards the future, specifically high-tech and sustainable industries. The narrative points to things like green energy, the digital economy, and AI as the next frontiers for collaboration. These are the areas that are supposed to define the next era of global development. And this really brings us to the ultimate point of the entire source material. The argument is that in the 21st century, economic success isn't going to come from nations trying to go it alone. Instead, it's going to be driven by countries that figure out how to innovate together. And that brings us full circle, right back to a big question.
In a world facing so many complex challenges, the vision presented here is betting everything on this one core idea: shared innovation. The question it leaves us with is, will that actually be the key?